the theme is community. And of course, to speak to us from the Division of Health, Wellness and Social Protection is Ms. Caroline James, Therapeutic Counsellor, and of course, Ms. Melina Alleyne, Mediator, of course, from the division. All right, so good morning, ladies, and welcome.
Good morning. Good
Very
morning.
good.
Thank you for having us.
Very good. Let's get straight to it. What is the relationship between mental health and the conflict management?
At the core of it, we cannot ignore one without the other. If you have poor mental health, it's going to affect the way you manage conflict and the way you handle conflict. And then depending on your current mental health status, that is going to have an effect on how profound that conflict can affect you. So it's very much kind of feeds into each other.
Very good. All right, and so how does the inability to manage your emotions lead to conflict?
So it's very important to be able to manage your emotions when dealing with conflict, because it can affect how you process information, etc. So for example, as a mediator, one of the things that we may notice in some instances is when we have clients, if they are not able to process information, or if they are angry, if they are unable to speak to the person, just being in a space with someone that you're in conflict with can bring across emotions or bring out emotions. So some instances we may even have to pause mediation because we can't deal with the conflict right now and send over to counseling, because you need to be able to be in a good mental space to be able to handle or address the conflict and the person you're in conflict with. So it's really important.
All right, so Ms. Caroline James, of course, what are some common mental health challenges people face dealing with conflict?
Well, it depends, of course, on how firstly the person's involved within the conflict. So generally, if it's conflict that's happening between co-workers versus conflict that's happening within families, conflict happening within couples, that could have a different effect on a person's actual mental health. So let's say we're dealing with, as what my colleague would have spoken about, let's say we're dealing with co-workers and they come in for mediation for a specific reason. Based on how that person could perceive their relationship with that co-worker, that could affect their mental health. From the counselor perspective, we have a type of conflict called inter and intrapersonal conflict. Intrapersonal conflict very often is what exactly Ms. Alleyne would have spoken to. When those persons actually is struggling to manage their conflict in a mediation space, and that has to do very much with how they perceive conflict and how they internalize conflict. So what could this lead to? This could lead to anger in terms of emotional dysregulation. This could lead to anxiety. This could lead to avoidance of something that could potentially trigger them. And then based on any past trauma and so on that they would have experienced, that could actually continue to affect them throughout this entire process. So that is why it is very important that based on where a person is mentally, how they process conflict kind of aligns within each other.
Let's say there's a supervisor who constantly gives me problem, and it's unjustifiable in my view.
Right.
I complain to HR. HR might be in cahoots with that supervisor. That will affect me in my performance. So productivity will be affected.
Of course it will.
How do you resolve that? That's a psychological. I am not speaking about it anymore because it's really painful, because I'm not getting justice. It's difficult to come to work because there's that presence. Even you walk into the room without even saying good morning, there is that presence of that evil that affects you.
Yes.
That's conflict unresolved.
Yes.
Let's speak to that, whichever you want to take it.
Okay, so in instances like that, that is actually, so one of the things I like to say is, if someone you have or are in conflict with, right, any actions they do, it's going to come across as negative. So that person says good morning, but you find they had a tone. Really and truly, they probably didn't have a tone, but because you have unresolved issues with that person, you're going to overlook or pinpoint certain things that they're probably not even trying to do. So that is actually a serious thing that happens, and it not only happens in organizations, and it's something that you will have to learn to separate people from problem. So it's very important to be able to separate a person from a problem, especially when you're working with someone, because you have to coexist, right? And coexisting healthily is important. So it may take finding some coping mechanisms. Maybe counseling might be an option or avenue that you might have to take to be able to cope with things that you cannot control. Because again, we have to remember the only person who you can control is yourself.
Very good.
So you have to make sure that you control your actions.
Ms. Caroline James, there are those who will not speak to you. Not speaking to me, we are in the same workplace, and we are not, I don't talk to she, I don't want to have nothing to do with she. That in itself is unresolved conflict. They have never addressed the real issue. You mentioned about a mediator coming in to deal with that so as they could have a settling of this matter. There are those who will not want to settle and carry that for the rest of their lives until retirement. You know, in some cases, so bring that, because what that does is affects your performance psychologically or not, and mentally. It's difficult to be in this space because there's that presence. You could almost feel it.
Yeah.
Speak to that, and all that. Beside the mediator, what else can be done in that circumstance?
Well, in that instance, if in fact that person comes to me in the capacity of a client, one of the key things I always remind clients is the idea of, the serenity prayer, accepting things you cannot change. And beyond just accepting things you cannot change, we also think about things that I can control versus things you cannot control. And one of the key things I always try to emphasize with clients is the power of choice. If you are in an unhappy work environment, or we understand financially you might feel it's not viable to leave that job, but I always tell persons, prioritize your mental peace. If you have gotten to the point where you have a manager, you have a supervisor, and you all are not communicating, you're like that in discord, and the communication has broken down to the point where you can't even communicate with each other, it might be wise that you try to make that choice for your own mental peace to seek alternative. That is what I always try to emphasize. What choice do you have? What do you have control of? What are some things that you can change versus some things you cannot change? Are the things that you can change, you move to change those things. The things that you cannot change, you have to let go. Right. And be satisfied with that choice.
Okay, all right, well, all right. Can you explain how people typically react to conflict and how it ties into your mental health? I think that's for you, Miss Alleyne.
So, a person's personality is what, well, a lot of things can determine how you handle conflict, right? We could look at the value you place on that relationship, right? You can also look at how you deal with conflict. We have different conflict styles. So as a person, you would know, okay, I would avoid this situation, or you're competing, or you're more compromising. You have different conflict styles, and these conflict styles will be determined based on the value you place on that relationship as well. So for example, you may go to KFC and you're upset about something that happened. How you deal with that conflict is based on the relationship. You might say, okay, well, I can go somewhere else and get something to eat, right? So when you deal with conflict, how you deal with conflict is based on a number of things, but some of the things we look at would be the conflict style you choose and the relationship you may have.
Ms. Caroline James, there are conflicts in the home among siblings.
Yes.
The one sister might be prettier than the other sister, and there is envy in the household. She borrows my clothes without my permission, and is trying to be like the pretty sister. And that in itself, the pretty sister not really taking she on, but there is that. She complains to mommy all the time, and mommy is favoring her because she's more pretty and she's more successful. That type of conflict is more than, it requires more than therapy, because it's spiritual too.
Okay.
Are we there? So let's talk to that type of conflict in the household among siblings. Kill your brother because of envy. Let's deal with that from that standpoint. How do you resolve that level of of conflict, envy, and it spins over in the workplace as well. But I just want to deal in the household, where is that level of mental instability among siblings because of envy.
Okay, so as someone who grew up with siblings, right, and sisters and so on, you have that kind of thing in the household where you want to borrow this and you want to borrow that. But what we have to recognize is that most persons, their conflict style doesn't just exist in a vacuum. It would have had a root somewhere. So in the household itself, how a person learns to deal with conflict between siblings, they would have either learned their conflict styles indirectly, meaning observing the way their parents or caretakers dealt with conflict, or they dealt with it directly, which is through punishment and reward, they understand what's the appropriate way to deal with conflict. So in other words, if it's okay for me to slap my sister and take back my things, I don't get punished for it, then I know to myself, okay, that's the way I resolve things. If I observe that my parents are in contention with each other and they argue about it, and that's the way it's solved, that's how I'm going to apply it. So speaking to your question, what has to do with siblings and rivalry, at the root, we have to first kind of uncover and unpeel what is the way this family generally manages conflict. Because there has to be and we have to sometimes unlearn. If it is in fact a negative conflict resolution style, we have to first uncover what that is and let them understand there's an alternative to how we manage conflict.
To recognize, and here's one, how can someone recognize when a conflict is affecting their emotional well-being?
So there are a number of ways that you'd know that will be happening. You might be anxious around that person, or you're just angry for no reason around the person, or in the space where where you're in conflict. So for example, the same instance with work, you said earlier, the person, they're just angry, they don't want to go to work. You may get headaches, so we have anxiety. So all of your body reflects how you feel, and paying attention to your body can let you know you're uncomfortable in a space, or you're not happy to be in a specific space. So those are some of the ways that we could identify that conflict is affecting us. You may get headaches, you're stressed, right? So yes, those are just a few of the ways that you can.
All right, if the job is naturally high stress, it's a very stressful environment to work in, and there is no stress relievers, so to speak, how do you find a common ground to de-stress? You may like a sport, however, or whatever that might contribute to you distressing. The job is by nature, the job. You like the job, however, it's a highly stressful, a stressful environment. What do you do in those circumstances? How does that, it affects your mental state, because you just can't wait to get off. But when you get off, there is no way really to deal with your stress. That affects you mentally. Where is help for that individual?
Okay, for that individual, what we emphasize to that individual is to find self-care tools. We emphasize that in terms of generally work is 8 hours a day. So the same way you schedule and you make it a priority to go to work and follow the demands of work, is also important that you try to carve out, even if it is an hour a day, even if it's 2 hours a week, something that you do for self-care for yourself. Because one of the key things that, even as a working adult, I've come to recognize is that we have to find space for ourselves to prioritize our self-care. So therefore, if we are dealing with a person who is just, like you would have said, highly stressed, don't know when to calm down, because what happens is when somebody says that they can't calm down, that means their brain is just going. So generally what we really try to help those persons do is suggest to ground themselves in the present, get back, regain control of their thoughts, their feelings, and their behavior, because that's what they have control of. So if it means just sitting after work and doing some deep breathing, if it means going for a walk, maybe a 30-minute walk at the end of the day, maybe on a Friday going out with some friends, so just almost sitting along with them and letting them develop a routine, a habit formation routine that emphasizes, just as important work is, play is also important, relaxation is also important.
How important it is to speak to the problem when it's at the boiling point, that you might lash out physically.
So how are we coping with conflict?
How are you coping?
How are we coping with conflict?
So that not to resort to violence, because that is sometimes the only resolve, or in your view, that may not necessarily be correct, and you may land yourself in trouble. but this person provoking me so my feet will hit, and so. So let's go to that as we get ready to wrap.
So first of all, what we would encourage is to take a few deep breaths, right? Now, we have a lot of times we have a misconception that conflict is bad. Conflict is not bad, but how we deal with it is what's bad. So the first thing we would do is encourage that you take a deep breath. And it's not always bad to address the problem. So you could pull the person aside and say, I want to have a conversation with you. Because if it's at a boiling point, that means that any simple things could be triggers, right? So we need to ensure that we don't get to that point. So we want to prevent, right? So we could have a conversation with the person, and having a conversation could mean that we resolve some issues. And in having this conversation, we could use some I statements. I feel. We don't blame. We try to not blame. We try to use words, because sometimes when dealing with conflict, if it is we deal with it in a way that it comes across accusatory, then that means that the person is going to get even more angered, right? So we have to be careful how we deal with it. So I feel as though you have wronged me. I could be wrong, so I just want to have a discussion about it. You create a space that is safe and healthy so that you find a calm space and you have the conversation. Tell them I want to have a conversation. And if not, well, you can get a third party. You don't necessarily have to come to mediation, but there must be somebody that both of you all trust that you can have any space. Say, I'm bringing this person into the space so that we can have a healthy conversation, because we have to coexist. We have to work for 8 hours. If we have to be in this space, it should not be this toxic. Let's have a conversation. If you want a third party, let's bring that person in.
What about a good cuss out? I'm not using obscene language. I mean, saying maybe a little, well, higher than the normal decibel of having a regular conversation, but to say what I feel about you, and the person in turn tell you a cuss out. In some cases, after the cuss out, the mediator would ask, how you feel? I feel better, yes, but I just don't want you to borrow none of my things on them again. You hear me? Right. So you have those scenarios where a good cuss out does settle it. So based on what the scenario was. It's not a violent cuss out, but it's just an exchange, a ventilation. That's the word. Is that recommended though? So
in mediation, we allow for persons to vent to some extent, but it's controlled. So in mediation, you don't have obscene language, and we allow people to express themselves. Because you have emotions, and when you have emotions, you need to express it. But you can express it healthily. So we allow that space where you let it out in a healthy way, and then after that, we could continue the conversation. Because some people have things on their chest, and they need to get it out.
If you carry those pains in your, it hurts physically, right? Because I can tell you, I remember when my mother died, I did not cry until I heard the stuff going down on the casket. And when I heard that, I bawled. I let it out. And when I was done, I could have fly. I felt light like a dove. Now, we carry those types of pain for one reason or the other. What is that? What is that? What is the label for that? You know, you wouldn't say trauma, but what is that? What is that labeled as? When you carry that pain without releasing it, is there a term for it from your field?
I'm sure that the name slips me right now, but I think what you're talking about in terms of having these pent-up kind of emotions, that they just feel like there's an outlet that needs to come out, right? What you were speaking about before with Ms. Alleyne in terms of just getting things out is what we encourage clients to do. It's called catharsis.
Catharsis?
Catharsis. Which is the process where you just release everything.
I heard that word before.
Right?
Okay.
So that could involve, like you said, that's getting everything out. There's even scream therapy that is encouraged, for persons just go in a room and they scream to the top of their lungs. Sometimes you allow them to destroy anything in a room. They destroy glass, they destroy bricks, they kind of get everything out. I don't know how prevalent it is in the Caribbean. I don't know how prevalent it is in the Caribbean, but I know that there's a place for it, at least in America. I've observed it there. What you're talking about in terms of vent-up emotions is that what makes it particularly difficult for a lot of persons is the simple fact that they don't feel the safe space and that security to get it out. Because what stops a person from doing that, from releasing what is there, is that they don't feel that they're in a space in which to do that. Right. In a place like a funeral, nobody really blinks twice when you're screaming to get it out. But if you have an internal thing that's going on with you, an unresolved matter, right? And you don't get a chance to get it out. That is where leads to a lot of issues that we see a lot of times with our clients.
Okay, I'll come into that just. There's a situation where heartbreak, a girl and you fall out and they're done. And you feel it. You are recommended, or just like you talk about scream, go in the bush and bawl where nobody could hear you and settle your score in the bush. It might sound funny, but it's the same thing as going in the room and scream. You know, I had that experience. And when I was done coming from the bush, I make sure nobody else see me. And I ball out in the bush. When I'm done, I come back out, and I was able to live after that. No, these are very hard. So there are so many different elements to mental health that if we do not pay attention, it can affect us negatively.
Yes.
In some cases, people have to be medicated and monitored, and that's when it's really bad. So talking to yourself a problem? When I say that, because sometimes I am at work, I'm doing and I'm talking to myself. I'm saying I could put this here, and then let me change my mind. I'll put it this here. So nothing is wrong with that. That's what you call that.
That's self-speech, which I a lot of times persons say talking to yourself is a sign of mental illness. I disagree, because I think to some degree they always say when you know that you're crossed the threshold of mental madness when you're asking yourself questions and answering. Even that is a little bit touchy for me. Right, but self-speech is something, if you really think about it, the interesting thing about self-speech is we see children do it all the time. Children sit by themselves and they play and they talk to themselves and they embody characters. But what happens is that when we get older, we internalize that self-speech. So our thoughts, when we're having a conversation ourselves generally, it's centered in our thoughts and we just kind of like rationalize it that way. But sometimes just to get the answers to questions, I found myself sometimes saying, maybe it's the best way I do it this way. And sometimes I actually say it at times, Carla, you think it's a good idea? I hope that doesn't make me sound deranged.
All right, but we mentioned trauma earlier, and I want to get Miss Alleyne. Yes. There are traumatic events that stays with you for the rest of your life. And if not treated, any reoccurrence of anything to resemble that can affect you. What is that? Well, it's a traumatic event that is as graphic as, you see it in your mind every time. Let's say that you're on the highway and you see an accident. Let's say you've been in an accident. I'm just using it. And it traumatizes you it affects you. It's still in your mind. You never got rid of it. And a reoccurrence of it and can set you off again. What has happened there? It's not resolved and it's not conflict, but it's an incident that affects you for the rest of it. How is that treated? Can it be treated?
So actually, I believe that Ms. James is the best person.
All right. Ms. James, what are we talking about there?
What you're saying could be diagnosed. Of course, you have to do an assessment that has to do with PTSD, whereby when you post-traumatic stress disorder, whereby you have experienced directly or indirectly a traumatic event or witnessed something very traumatic, and you constantly relive it. The reliving of that event is what we call a triggering episode. So anything that reminds you of it, it could be a scent, it could be a sound, it could be just being in the area, just brings you right back to that event. All right. So what you notice in that type of traumatic episode, what we are treating therefore with counseling has to do with what I've spoken before about intrapersonal which is basically a conflict against the mind with the body. Because although I'm in a safe space, technically I'm home, I could smell something and it brings me back to the event. Wow. So I'm almost tricked into believing that I'm right there in the event. So therefore, to be able to remedy that, the work has to do with the thoughts, the transforming of the thoughts, and also has to do with the emotional feeling. Because generally, when you're under a lot high level of stress, as what you will be if you're in a traumatic episode, your body responds to it. Your body gets into the fight, flight, flee, or fawn effect. Right? Fighting, and that's basically an evolutionary thing our body does. Our body kind of prepares us for an event. But if I'm sitting in my room and there's no external threat, but I'm feeling my pores raising, I'm feeling my heart rate speeding up, I'm feeling like I'm doing deep breathing, like if I'm struggling to breathe, my pupils become dilated, that's your body preparing you for an event. So therefore, the work that has to go in with that person is basically regaining control of their mind. Because the mind, your brain doesn't know whether you're in a present place or if you are in the past event. So therefore, that's where I would have mentioned before, grounding, getting that person to recognize that a lot of times our thoughts and our mind could be deceptive. What we are living in the present is what we are experiencing, and therefore that's where our focus needs to be.
When you use your imagination, right, and last thing before we go, right, and you're a creative individual, you see things that people cannot see. Let's say I have a vision in some cases to create something that is, there are those who would say, boy, you crazy boy, in a good way, because the imagination goes in places that, is not normal for the average onlooker. And when you go there and you bring this into life, you are deemed as a genius, and so on. When the imagination is at work for the creative realm, and if you talk the orange economy and so on, and that person could create something that out of nothing. What goes there when the imagination goes into those realms? Only people like me could understand what I'm saying.
Yes,
I hope you understand.
Yes. I think what you're talking about there, I can't remember the exact psychological term, but there's something called the past self, the present self, and the future self. Your imagination tends to place you in your future self, or your ideal self, where you're kind of looking onward into something that you could create, into something that you can achieve. And the reason why persons tend to be skeptical, because it's not happening now in the present. They have no evidence of it coming into reality. So therefore, what a person is trying to do is basically merge that future self with the present self in whatever form that could take. The benefits of that is that it helps you to drive forward. It allows you to see an idea that you want to see into the future, and you're going to see what you can do within your present self to get you as quick as possible to that future self. That's basically what it is, right? So it's it's something that a lot of times we will encourage. Sometimes with our clients, I want you to create what would your ideal life look like, and what can you do now?
Why did I ask you that? And you see, I'm really enjoying the conversation, and we got to go, right? But and to stay with Mental Health Month, obviously the theme is community. The last two that were here, try to remember the names, we delved into one particular area and so on, and so we are here this morning. What are the plans going forward? Obviously, I know that they plan to go to any community to promote Mental Health Month. What are the plans going forward? Yeah.
Well, we do have some activities coming within the rest of the month that if you stay tuned to the Division of Health's page, all of those plans will be unfolded there. And also later on in the year, we do have plans for Mental Health Day. And all of those things would be on the page, but I don't want to just divulge everything just yet. But stay tuned to the division's page. It's very active, so all the activities that will be coming forward would be on the page.
All right, so should anyone want to contact you to get advice, you're open. I think the number was 6838, no?
8341.
You see, I write it down here, man.
Yes, that's good.
6838341.
That is correct.
Any one of you would be able to assist.
Yes, a counselor will be on the other end of that number. That will be specifically for therapeutic services, to be able to access our therapeutic services. For mediation services, I believe there's another number.
So we have a contact number. It's 798.
Hold on. 798.
5805.
5805?
05, yes. And you can also walk into the Division of Health, and you just let them know you're there to speak to someone in mediation, and you could do a referral on the spot.
All right, very good, ladies. I want to thank you all very much for being here this morning, and there's so much